All right, class. Today we're actually getting more into chapter 13. In our last lecture, we basically covered a lot of the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. Today we get more into the classifications of cerebral white matter. And when we start looking at the cerebral white matter and the classifications of them, one of the things that we actually have to look at are commissural fibers. Now, commissural fibers, while they are white matter, they're actually there to connect the gray matter of the two hemispheres. These include the corpus callosum, which is the largest of our commissural fibers, but also includes the anterior and the posterior commissures. Our second type of fiber is an association fiber. Now, association fibers connect different parts of the same hemisphere. And then our third classification is a projection fiber. And a projection fiber connects the hemispheres with lower brain or spinal cord regions. So we're going to have fibers from the upper levels of the brain that actually project down and extend down into our lower brain and spinal cord regions. The example of our projection fiber really includes the internal capsule, which is a compact band that passes between the thalamus and some of our basal nuclei. So if we look at those three different types, you'll see we kind of take a mid-sagittal cut of our brain going right down the longitudinal fissure. Our corpus callosum you see right here in the center, and you'll see that it's got these blue dots in it. Those blue dots are representing fibers that help to connect one side of the brain to the other. As we look at the purple components here, these are what we will call association fibers. These are all the fibers that are still connecting the brain hemispheres, but they're doing it all on the same side. So you'll notice here we have the parietal lobe, here we have the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe. You'll notice that we have different fibers that are extending from the frontal lobe up here all the way back to the occipital lobe, and also different areas within the parietal lobe connecting to each other. We also notice that we see not only the corpus callosum, which is this big section, but we also can see the anterior commissure on this graphic. If we look at more of a coronal section, you get a better idea of what these commissural fibers do. Again, we're connecting one side to the other. And then you'll also notice in green that we do have projection fibers. Again, projection fibers are going from upper levels of the brain to lower levels of the brain or spinal cord. And so we have this projection of these fibers going all the way down through the brainstem and down into the spinal cord as they project from one location to the other. Here you'll notice that we still have this coronal section of the cerebrum and the diencephalon, where again we're still getting a good representation of the white matter, including the corpus callosum. You'll see we also do have the internal capsule. And then here we have the gray matter representation here in the cerebral cortex. Now, as we look at the cerebral cortex and we continue with lateralization of the brain, we have to understand that there are hemispheres that are specialized. Now, I know we've touched on this a little bit already as far as right side and left side. There are two sides of the cerebrum, the right and the left, and they exhibit differences in the higher order functions. Categorical hemisphere is typically the left side. This hemisphere is usually specialized for language abilities, and it functions in categorization and analysis. It's usually this left hemisphere that contains Wernicke's area and the motor speech area. The representational hemisphere is usually the right hemisphere in most people, and it's more concerned with the visual spatial relationships, imagination, and the comparison of senses. Now, to communicate through the corpus callosum, again, fibers that are connecting both sides, as well as other commissural fibers. You'll notice in this graphic that this shows a little bit more of the lateralization function between the two hemispheres. The left hemisphere does show some of the speech areas. Um, it does show right hand motor control as it's going to cross over and control the right side. And this is where we see that decussation, or what we know as crossing over. And you can compare that to the right side and how some of it also again controls the left side of the body. One thing that you do want to take a look at is how our vision fields are utilized. You'll notice that on this left eye and the right eye, we have these green fibers and purple fibers. When we look at this, notice where the green fibers actually control the field of vision. Green fibers cross over as well. And so when we look at the green part of the eye here, this controls the right visual field. And then as it comes in, it actually will stay basically to the same side and stay in the left optic nerve. The purple side is this left visual field, and it comes in and it rides down the purple neuron and it crosses over. And then compare that to the right side. And so you get an idea of what happens when you have a lesion or an issue in this area where my mouse pointer is, or compared to where this particular lesion may be. So if we have a lesion here in this left eye at this location, we'll actually lose vision in the left eye. However, if we have a lesion back here where it's just the green section, we're actually going to lose vision in this right visual field of both eyes, but still have vision in the left visual field of both eyes. So let's look at some of the distribution of the white and the gray matter. The brain and the spinal cord is composed of both different types of tissue, both gray matter and white matter. Remember, white matter tends to be the myelinated, and the gray matter tends to be unmyelinated. Gray matter also is made up of the neurons of the cell bodies, the dendrites, and again, those unmyelinated axons. The cortex of the brain in the cerebrum is that superficial layer of the gray matter. Remember our definition for nuclei, which are clusters of cell bodies that we find in the CNS. Nuclei are regions of gray matter, and they're either close to the surface or they can be found deep within the brain. White matter, on the other hand, consists of myelinated axons, and they're organized into bundles called tracts. And again, if we remember that definition, tracts are collections of nerve processes found within the CNS. So let's look at some of those areas of the brain as we touch on those secondary brain vesicles. We've already spent a lot of time on the telencephalon, and that telencephalon really is the cerebral cortex and a big chunk of those right and left hemispheres. The diencephalon starts to get more into the deep tissue of the brain. So when we look at the diencephalon, we have three paired structures, meaning there's one on the right side and the left side. So we have our thalamus, our hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. And the diencephalon is the part of the brain that encloses the third ventricle. If we look at the diencephalon, this is a mid-sagittal section of our brain tissue. You'll notice here we have our corpus callosum. We'll talk about the choroid plexus here that's found in that third ventricle. But then we look at some of the diencephalon structures. We have our thalamus, which is this large section right in the center of the graphic. We have our epithalamus, which you'll notice kind of falls more towards the back side here. And then we have our hypothalamus, which you'll notice is all the way to the front. And then you also notice that the pituitary gland kind of extends off of that hypothalamus. And then you'll notice this little ring here. That little stalk indicates our infundibulum, and we'll talk about that coming up. So first off, we have our thalamus. Now the thalamus is the largest structure of the diencephalon, and it makes up about 80% of the diencephalon. It makes up the superior lateral walls of the third ventricle and is going to contain several nuclei that are named for their location. The nuclei will project and receive fibers from the cerebral cortex, and one of the major functions of the thalamus is basically to act as a relay center. Now, if we look at the thalamus, here it kind of shows us a lot of those nuclei. Remember, again, nuclei are collections of cell bodies found in the CNS. So we have all these nuclei locations. Now, we're not going to need to know all the names of these, but you can take a look at them so that you get an idea of what the names actually look like and what they represent. Oftentimes, they're really just named for the location that they make up in the thalamus itself. And what are some of the functions of the thalamus? Well, I've already indicated that it is a relay center, but it's also the gateway to the cerebral cortex. And one of the major things that it does is it helps to sort, edit, as well as relay the information from the brain down to the rest of the body and vice versa. What it really does, though, more specifically, is to mediate sensation, motor activities, cortical arousal, learning, and memory. The hypothalamus forms the infralateral walls of the third ventricle. It also, as the thalamus, contains many nuclei that include the mammillary bodies. These are also paired structures, so there is going to be right and a left hypothalamus, which also then include paired nuclei. One of the major functions of the hypothalamus is to act as an olfactory relay station. And one of the hallmarks here is that it does contain the infundibulum, which the infundibulum is essentially the stalk that connects to the pituitary gland. So here we have our hypothalamus. And you'll notice that here's our thalamus, and then just inferior and anterior to the thalamus is our hypothalamus. You'll be able to identify a lot of these nuclei again, but then we also are able to identify that infundibulum, which is again the stalk that helps to connect the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. When we look at some of the functions of the hypothalamus, we really look at a lot of autonomic control. So it is an autonomic control center for many of our visceral functions, which include blood pressure, the rate and the force of the heartbeat, as well as digestive tract motility. It's also a major center for the emotional response, and it's involved in the perception of pleasure, fear, and rage, as well as looking at the biological rhythms and drives of our body. So then we get to the epithalamus. Now the epithalamus is the most dorsal portion of the diencephalon and helps to form the roof of the third ventricle. It does contain the pineal gland, which extends from the posterior border, and the pineal gland really secretes melatonin. And melatonin is responsible or aids in the regulation of our sleep and wake cycles. So that was our diencephalon. So we've now covered of our secondary brain vesicles, we've covered our telencephalon and the diencephalon. We're now left with 3 secondary brain vesicles, and they all help to make up the brainstem and the cerebellum. And the 3 regions of that brainstem is going to be the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So if we look at the brainstem and we look at the structure, it's really going to be very similar to the spinal cord, but it does contain a lot of embedded nuclei. The function of the brainstem is really a lot of our automatic behaviors and autonomic behaviors that really give us the ability for survival. It contains fiber tracts that help to connect the higher and lower neural centers, and the brainstem is associated with 10 of the 12 pairs of our cranial nerves. So here we have the anterior view of the brainstem, which is going to include the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And so you can see the midbrain up through here. You can see the pons just below that. And then just inferior to the pons, you see the medulla oblongata as it transitions itself right into the spinal cord here at the bottom. If we take a look at the posterior lateral view, again, you can see those same structures where they lead up to as it gets up into the thalamus before we transition into the larger portion of the cerebrum. So our first portion of the brainstem is going to be the midbrain. Now the midbrain is going to be located between the diencephalon and the pons. You'll notice that the pons is just inferior to the midbrain, but then also if you look at the previous graphic that we just looked at, or the previous two graphics we just looked at, you'll notice that just above the midbrain, we really were able to isolate or identify the thalamus, which again makes up the largest portion of the diencephalon. Within the midbrains, we have what we call cerebral peduncles, which contain our pyramidal motor tracts. It also contains the cerebral aqueduct, which is that channel that connects the third and the fourth ventricles and is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Within the midbrain, we've identified before, even within the spinal cord, between the brainstem itself, we have a lot of nuclei that help to control different cranial nerves. Specifically, when we get into the midbrain, we have nuclei that help to control cranial nerves 3 and 4. And we'll get more into our cranial nerves a little bit later. But cranial nerves 3 and 4 are really involved with eye movements. And those are the ocular motor nerve, which is cranial nerve 3, and the trochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve 4. We also have the substantia nigra, and the substantia nigra is functionally linked to the basal nuclei. And one of the things research has showed us is that lesions found in this area are often thought to be responsible for Parkinson's disease. So we really link Parkinson's disease to the substantia nigra here. And one of the ways that we treat it is with dopamine. So as we take a look at a cross-section of the midbrain, you'll notice where this section is actually coming off of. So we take the cross-section here and we look at it, basically looking down or up at it, but we're going to look down at this particular view. You can see where the anterior side and the posterior side of the midbrain is. You'll notice that there are a bunch of different colors in through here, and these colors are indicating different nuclei that are found at this level of the brainstem. You'll notice here in this kind of brown color, this is our substantia nigra. And again, that's the nuclei that we just discussed that regards to or relates to Parkinson's disease. You'll notice all the way in the back, we have the cerebral aqueduct as it's passing from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. So the next part of the brainstem is the pons. Now the pons is going to form the anterior wall of the fourth ventricle. And the fibers of the pons are going to help to connect the brain centers of the upper levels and the spinal cord. It's also going to help relay impulses between the motor cortex and the cerebellum. And we'll talk more about the cerebellum later, but the cerebellum is often involved in creating a blueprint for movements. The nuclei that are going to help maintain the normal rhythm of breathing are also going to be located within our pontine tissue. So we take again another look at the brainstem. This time we're focusing more on the pons level. And so if we look at this structure, here you'll notice where the pons is. And you can see some of the other structures that are coming in. But if we take a cross section and essentially look right through where my arrow is cutting, you'll notice that we get all the way into this area. Now this area includes our fourth ventricle. You'll notice how it opens up quite a bit. Again, anterior and posterior. You'll see where some of these additional nuclei are all located throughout the entire pons region. So then we get to the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata joins the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. It's going to form part of the ventral wall of the fourth ventricle, and it contains the choroid plexus of that fourth ventricle. And the choroid plexus is going to be responsible for helping to create our cerebrospinal fluid. The medulla oblongata also contains the pyramids, which the pyramids are going to be identified as being two ventral longitudinal ridges that are formed by pyramidal tracts. And our pyramidal tracts are a type of motor tract. So they are a descending tract that go downward. They go from the brain toward the spinal cord. It's at this point that we have the decussation, or the crossing over of those pyramids. Now, the pyramids are also known as cortical spinal tracts. I am going to draw this or highlight this term here, because when we look at cortical spinal and we look at the term tract, we already know what a tract is. And a tract is these collections of nerve processes that we find in the CNS. This term, corticospinal, tells us a lot about what type of tract this is. It tells us where it starts and where it goes towards. And from that, we can also distinguish whether it's ascending or sensory, or descending or motor. So if it's an ascending tract, we typically would see it start with spinal and end with something. In this case, it starts with cortical, which refers to the cortex, and it ends with spinal. So this cortical spinal tract starts in the cerebral cortex and goes down towards the spinal cord, indicating it goes from top to bottom, and also indicating that it's a descending tract. Anything going from brain to spinal cord is telling us that it's a motor fiber or a motor tract. So our brain, in this case, is telling parts of our body what to do. So in the medulla oblongata, we have what we know as autonomic reflex centers. These are going to be reflexes that involve a lot of our internal organs. It also contains a cardiovascular center, which, as I'm sure you can guess, involves the heart and our blood vessels. So the medulla oblongata helps to adjust the force and the rate of our heart contraction. But it also involves the vascular component of the cardiovascular system. And so the vasomotor center of the medulla oblongata helps to adjust the blood vessel diameter for blood pressure regulation. So it really is helping in dilation and constriction of those vessels. It also has respiratory centers. So it does work with some of the centers, the respiratory centers in the pons. But what the medulla oblongata does, it helps to generate the respiratory rhythm, and in conjunction with the pontine centers, helps to control the rate and the depth of breathing. There are some additional centers. Again, you'll notice that these are, for the most part, autonomic. We have vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. And when you look at coughing, yes, you can generate a voluntary cough, but we also have some autonomic coughing reflexes. So if we take a look at the medulla oblongata and we look at the cross section, you'll notice that we have, again, some cranial nerves that are coming in and are going to have their nuclei found in the medulla. It is going to contain the fourth ventricle, and so we're making up that anterior wall of the fourth ventricle. You will notice some of these other nuclei that are located there. But we can also look at some of these other structures, particularly as we get through here in this area. Here you'll notice that we have the decussation of the pyramids. So we have this crossing over of these fibers at that location. And again, these are descending fibers. These are the cortical spinal tracts or cortical spinal axons. As we're moving down the pyramids, we have the crossing over and we have the cortical spinal axons. Here's a lateral view of the medulla. You get a chance to see the different nuclei as we can see through here. But again, just kind of a lateral view of taking a look at the medulla as it sits within the brainstem. On this graphic, we get a chance to see the brainstem and how it relates to the spinal cord itself. Again, notice that it's normally going to become the spinal cord as it exits that foramen magnum of the occipital bone, and then it becomes the spinal cord. If we take a look at the medulla and we look at the cross section, here you have your fourth ventricle again, and here is your gray matter core. Now, if we take a look at the spinal cord, you'll notice that that fourth ventricle has really converted itself to that central canal. And here we have our gray matter core butterfly as indicated on this part of the graphic. So the last structure that we're going to talk about regarding the brain is the cerebellum. And so we look at the anatomy of the cerebellum, and it also is divided into two hemispheres. However, those hemispheres are connected by what we call a vermis. If we break up the hemispheres, just as we have lobes in the cerebrum, we also have lobes in the cerebellum. You'll notice those right here. We have the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the floccular-nodular lobe. Helping to make up the cerebellum is also what we call foliae. Now, if you remember, gyri are the ridges that we found on the surface of the cerebral cortex. We also have gyri located in the cerebellum. However, in the cortex, you'll notice that they're kind of irregular and they move around. In the cerebellum, they're arranged transversely. If we open up the cerebellum, you'll notice that we have a arbor vitae, which is a distinctive tree-like pattern of the cerebellar white matter. So if we look at the graphic here, this is looking at the cerebellum from the top side. So this is a superior view. Here you have one of your hemispheres, and here is another hemisphere. You'll notice that you have the anterior lobe to the front side, the posterior lobe to the back side. And it doesn't show the floccular-nodular lobe here. The other thing you were looking at is the arbor vitae. Now the arbor vitae is this tree-like pattern if we do kind of a cross-section or a mid-sagittal cut. And you'll notice again that tree-like pattern going through, and then also the transversely arranged foliae. So what are some of the structural components of that cerebellum? Well, within the cerebellum, we have three thick nerve tracts that help to connect the cerebellum to the brainstem, because we obviously have to have some sort of connection so that we're able to communicate cerebellum to the rest of the brain. And you'll notice that we have what we call cerebellar peduncles. So we have a superior, a middle, and an inferior cerebellar peduncle. The superior is going to connect the cerebellum to the midbrain. The middle connects the cerebellum to the pons, and the inferior connects the cerebellum to the medulla. And so we are basically going from most superior to inferior as it connects to the brainstem. So how do we look at the functioning of that cerebellum? Well, one of the things I mentioned earlier is that the cerebellum helps to create this blueprint of movements. And so what it does is as the brain is kind of creating this pattern of what it wants to do, the cerebellum helps to fine-tune some of those movements. And so it ensures that muscle activity follows a correct pattern of movement. It also helps to store memories of previously learned movements so that you're able to recreate and continue with those types of movements that you've recalled. It helps to regulate activity along the voluntary and involuntary motor pathways. It also adjusts the movements initiated by the cerebrum, and it does this to ensure that there is a smoothness to the pattern as opposed to kind of a choppy or broken up pathway. It also helps to maintain the equilibrium and posture. And so it's going to receive proprioceptive information from our muscles and joints. And so as it does this, then it's continuously receiving motor plans from the cerebrum, but it's also receiving sensory feedback from the rest of the body. And it utilizes this motor information and sensory information to help generate these error correcting signals. And so it makes these corrections so that they can be sent then to the premotor and the primary motor cortex in order to really create a good smooth pattern of movement from within the brain tissue. So this image or this graphic really helps us to identify some of the cerebellar pathways. So you can utilize the red lines, blue lines, green lines, and yellow lines and see where this information is coming from and going to. You'll notice the red is voluntary movement. So it's coming from our frontal lobe, particularly coming from a lot of the premotor cortex or the primary motor cortex. As it moves down, it goes down into the spinal cord. It generates a particular movement as it moves into the spine, or as it gets from the spinal cord to the rest of the body. But you also notice that some of those, or some of that information moves into the cerebellum. We'll also notice the yellow information. All right, let me take a step back. We'll also notice the blue information. This is the proprioceptive input that comes from our joints, our muscles, our ligaments, tendons, and it comes up the spinal cord and it enters the cerebellum. From here, we now take the information and integrate it and analyze it. So it's processing both motor signals and sensory signals, processing all that information, and then sending up some correct feedback back up to the brain. So the cerebellum then sends these impulses through the thalamus to the primary motor cortex and then to the motor nuclei in the brain stem. So again, take this graphic and utilize it as a really good understanding of the things that we're looking at when it comes to the cerebellum and how it processes both motor information and sensory information. We'll go ahead and stop here, but let's go ahead and make today's attendance question the cerebellum. Since that's what we ended on, it'll be a good code word for today. So today's attendance code word is cerebellum.